Welcome back. Next, we are going to hear from Jodi Krause, who is the Brain Injury Education Coordinator in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at Children's Hospital in Colorado. She's a hospital-based educator and academic liaison certified as a special education specialist K through 12th grades and general education teacher K through 6. Jodi is part of the multidisciplinary team that teaches students currently hospitalized following a severe brain injury and that supports families, students, and classroom teachers as kids transition from the hospital back to a school setting at discharge. Additionally, Jodi serves on the concussion team at Children's Hospital in Colorado. So Jodi, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to apologize first for the amount of times I'm going to clear my throat. We have quite the wildfire situation out here in Colorado, so it is really doing a number, even in the city, on all of our respiratory things. So I've got a lot of water with me, and I'm probably going to clear my throat more than I'd like to, so just bear with me. So yeah, thanks for having me. This topic, I feel like we could have an entire day-long presentation on, and we have at Children's Hospital of Colorado talked about, we've had a couple different school symposiums for physicians and for families, and so this is a huge topic. So today I feel like I've taken a couple layers of it and skimmed over it pretty quickly, but hopefully some relevant information will come out of this for everybody, and you'll feel a little bit more versed in talking with school teams about your patients or about your own children. So I'm putting this out there because there are so many plans and support plans in a public school setting, and it's hard to know which one you're asking for when everybody else is using different acronyms, and it seems like people are not entirely speaking the same language. So, and I say public because a lot of these initiatives and a lot of these laws, are federal, and so private schools who do not accept any federal funding often don't have any of these programs. They might have some kind of an equivalent, but it's not entirely the same thing. So we're going to spend the bulk of today looking at an individualized education program, or an IEP. So that is under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We'll also look a little bit at 504 plans. It's also an accommodation plan in school, but it's a general education initiative. Lots of children with chronic medical needs or complex diagnoses additionally have a healthcare plan. And in Colorado, I'm sure it's called a different name elsewhere, but we also have READ Act plans for kids that are below grade level. We have ALPs, advanced learning plans, for kids that are in the gifted and talented range, and you can have more than one of these things at a time. So I think out here with our reading plans, if you have an IEP, it kind of trumps your reading plan. Typically, you don't have an IEP and a 504, but certainly there are a large number of kids that fall in the twice exceptional category of having an IEP and an advanced plan. That might be a child with attention deficit, it might be a child with dyslexia, who has both. So it can be overwhelming. So if you can familiarize yourself in your individual states with the different support plans and extension plans out there, I think that's always a good thing to do. So again, today we're going to talk more about the first two. So going in briefly to the difference between the two, like I mentioned right away, it's two different laws, two different legislations that are coming out in education. So IEPs fall under this one on the left, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and 504s fall under the Rehab Act of 1973. So since their creation, there's been some different iterations of them. We've amended certain things in IDEA, we've reauthorized it a couple different times. So it's a work in progress, but this is kind of the where it came from, the timeline of these different services. So let's go off into this different screen, and we will go through a little bit of the difference between the two plans. So this is a document I created for Children's Hospital Colorado that I'm happy to share with MDA, with the participants, if you guys want access to this. It again is going to be a skimming the surface, but it gives a little bit more clarity on the difference between the two. So under an IEP, you've got a carefully written plan, and the basic difference is IEPs will account for changes to the physical environment, accommodations to the physical learning environment, while additionally asking for teachers to change the delivery of instruction. So that's the difference. 504 plans will account for changes to the regular education physical environment, but will not have anything in there about a change in delivery of instruction, a modification to a curriculum, an intervention, specific intervention being used. That's going to be under IEP. 504 is not going to include that specific, curricular changes and instructional changes. School-based therapies generally only exist under the IEP. So OT, PT, speech, oftentimes the mental health stuff, vision specialists, hearing specialists, any type of services that your kiddos need will fall, that's going to automatically kind of loop them over into the IEP. I have worked with some schools that say, oh, sure, we can do a 504 plan and we can provide some speech therapy under that or some OT under that, but it's rare that I see that. And it's one of those things that I think it's like a per school basis. So if you're in a setting where your child has a 504 plan and the principal's like, oh yeah, no problem, we can do therapy under the 504 plan, should that principal leave or should the team roll over, you might hear something different from the next person. So who can receive support under these different plans? A disability that impacts a child's ability to learn and falls into 13 different disabilities stated in IDEA, and that disability has direct educational impact. So that's those kids under IEPs. For 504 plans, you've got two basic requirements. You have a disability, and that disability impacts how they participate in a regular education setting. Children who don't qualify for IEPs may end up qualifying for the 504 plan. Like I said before, you usually do not have both. A little bit more scripted, the legal piece and what the sequence of steps is, a little bit more scripted under an IEP. Written permission is required to initiate the process. Under 504, I've not really seen verbal be okay, but technically it is. Most times I've seen the same thing. It is a written permission, whether that's a parent who writes a letter or sends an email saying, I, Joe parent, wish for a 504 would like to request a 504 evaluation for my child, signed and date. I usually see it that way. But under an IEP, it must be written. It must be written permission. The team on an IEP is, again, a bit more scripted. So you've got to have the parent, the gen ed teacher, and a special ed teacher. You have to have a special education designee or representative, in addition to the school psychologist or someone who can interpret the results. Sometimes the school psychologist can sign in two places, or the special education case manager can sign in two places, being the teacher and also being the representative if they're not the case manager for your kiddo. 504 team's looser. You gotta have a parent, you gotta have a gen ed teacher. Maybe you have someone from the special education team that is also participating. In my son's school, for example, he's got a 504 plan, and the psychologist also heads up the 504 plan. So she sits on both the IEP and the 504 team. And typically there's a nurse, because oftentimes there is a medical need or a med administration or something that is falling under this 504. So usually a school nurse is present. And if they're not, I think they should be. I think they should be present in the IEP meeting, and I additionally think they should be present in the 504 meeting. But again, it's looser and varies from school to school on how they set up the 504 team. Under an IEP, they're going to get a bit more detailed, and there's going to have goals. That's not going to happen under a 504. So on an IEP, you for sure are going to have conversations about present levels of functioning. You definitely are going to look at different disability checklists and check boxes that yes, this is present in your kiddo, or no, it is not. You're going to discuss how much time is spent in each setting. You're going to discuss and get pretty specific about minutes of service. So 50 minutes of literacy weekly or 30 minutes of speech language pathology or speech language therapy monthly. So you're going to get a bit more specific on that IEP. And additionally, you're going to review if your child's needs are significant enough. There are alternate state assessments. So you're also going to go and look at if you're going to take the regular assessments or the special education. And for 504s, you're going to go into identified strengths and needs, some accommodations that are going to help the child perform better in the classroom, who's going to be responsible for ensuring that that support is happening, and then again, who's going to be the staff that oversees the entire 504 plan. IEPs are reviewed with an annual, obviously every year, annual, but you're not going to re-eval until every 3 years. And in the re-eval, you're having that conversation about whether services are still needed or not. So it's almost like, do you still qualify or do you not qualify? There is no legal requirement in a 504 plan to meet, but I think it's a good idea to do it at least once a year, same with an IEP. Just because it is reviewed once a year does not mean it can't be reviewed sooner. You are absolutely able to ask for additional IEP meetings. And 504 law calls for periodic reviews. So again, the interpretation of the district that you're in, but I think it's good to do that every 3 years. I just like that window that is laid out by IDEA. I don't think it's a bad idea for 504s to follow the same suit. So that's the basic difference. And when I explain it to parents at the hospital, it's just like I said when we started. IEPs are going to give you some accommodations to the physical learning environment and require that the instruction be different. 504s are going to accommodate the environment and not change the instruction. So when I was talking to Nicole and I was asked to do this, I am not at all going to pretend to be an expert in muscular dystrophy. We do have several muscle clinics at Children's Hospital. I am the rehab teacher, so I do know a bit about muscular dystrophy, but like my bio that Nicole read, I'm a brain injury education specialist, so not trying to pretend anything here, but did a lot of reading and spoke with my chief. And I am aware, the majority of students with muscular dystrophy are going to qualify for the IEP, and a very small percentage are going to have the 504 plan. Research shows that it's 20% typically of boys with Duchenne's qualify under an intellectual disability. 40% of kids with muscular dystrophy will qualify under specific learning disability, and about a third, 33% will qualify under an attentional weakness or ADD or ADHD. And our chief over at Children's, when we were chatting about this, let me know, that what's written there at the bottom. So when we think about dystrophin and the protein in the skeletal and cardiac muscles as the cause of the issues for boys with Duchenne's, there are also dystrophin isoforms in the brain, which create the more unique cognitive profile that is described in the literature. So the rest of what we're going to chat about today is a bit more about the IEP process. What are you agreeing to? How do you know if you're getting what you need? And how do you be a better active player in your child's IEP process? So, nutshell, you have a referral for an evaluation. You have the assessment and the evaluation time period. You have a meeting where you all determine eligibility together. The plan is written. You can have several different iterations. This is taken from a document at Children's Hospital. I would maybe reword it. The IEP meeting and the eligibility determination are happening at the same time. So that's happening at the meeting. The school team may pre-meet and chat about the results of the evaluation, but really the actual determination is happening in the meeting with the parent present. You can request the evaluation in writing, like I said, or your school team can bring it up to you as something that they'd like to consider. There are other processes that school teams follow that are more specifically geared towards learning disabilities, and you may have a couple different acronyms for that too. So response to intervention, or RTI, is a team or a process in a school where they identify a child is struggling compared to peers, make a plan to put in some interventions to support meet to evaluate the efficacy of those interventions, tweak them, keep them, move forward. It can be a really long, drawn out process. And it's all well intended and good, but when you look at IDEA and you look at the evaluation process as defined by the law, it is not supposed to delay the delivery of services. So many children, with complex medical needs like muscular dystrophy are part of a multidisciplinary team at a children's hospital like ours, and probably have cognitive reports and neuropsych evaluations and therapy summaries and discharge. All of that should be shared with the team in an effort to build the body of evidence during the IEP process. So what I mean by that is, an outside evaluation doesn't have to be the word of God. School teams don't have to agree with it. I think they should, but they don't have to. But if there is an outside evaluation that is known to a school team, they must legally reference it in their evaluation. So if you've got these outside reports, if you work with neuropsychologists and psychologists regularly and therapists in the outpatient setting, connect those folks, share those evals, because hopefully you can expedite the IEP process, because it can be, again, interpreted state to state, but typically it's 60 days to conduct the eval, and then another 30 days to get together and write the plan. If a school year is 181 average days, 90 days to me is kind of silly for this process. I think if we know what we know and we have experts in the medical field working with these kids daily, let's share what we have and move the process along. So like we said, about 20% of kids qualify for intellectual disability. In some places it is just referred to as ID. In some school districts and states it's referred to as SLIC, significant limited intellectual capacity. And in order to qualify for this, and this is just such a thorn in my side, in order to qualify for this, intellectual capacity must be sub-average and occur at the same time as sub-average adaptive skills. So typically children with IQs in the 70s, below 80, we've got the bell curve up here, right? So you've got your 85 to 115, you can see on that diagram, is considered, the average-ish range, with 100 being the mean, so dead average being the mean. One standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean is considered the average range. So when you're at about a 70 IQ, you're 2 standard deviations away from average. That's pretty significant, right? So kids in the 70s IQ range would typically qualify with an intellectual disability. However, on the adaptive rating scales that school teams give or psychologists give, they're giving one to the teacher, they're giving one to the parent, and you're rating the adaptive skills, like how independent are they in their activities of daily living? How independent are they in managing money, cooking a meal, managing homework expectations after school? They look at those 2 scores together to determine if intellectual disability is really the appropriate diagnosis. And unfortunately, if the adaptive skills are too high, they won't give this label, and instead they give the learning disability label, which kind of changes the services, and in my opinion isn't as appropriate a level of service as if your child would just qualify for the intellectual disability like we know that they have. This is going to be another checklist during the IEP process that everyone's going to do together at the meeting. They're going to sit down and say, ask questions and check boxes on this checklist to see if this is the most appropriate disability code. Specific learning disability is a little bit different. It's defined as a disorder in one or more psychological processes that may impact written and spoken language, an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, write, do math calculation, etc. That response to intervention that I was talking about is really intended for specific learning disability. Other names I've heard in schools are MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, RTI or MTSS. So to capture the learning disability, what the gold standard is in special education is to not jump all the way to the evaluation process, to bring the child up to the committee, to examine what the deficit is, identify some interventions that might support remediating the deficit, track progress, meet again, tweak the intervention, track progress, meet again. So again, well intended, but can kind of delay the qualification process. Once upon a time, we qualified SLD. Let me caveat that. There are certain places in Colorado that are not once upon a time, that are still doing it what we would consider the old way. So I'm assuming that's nationwide. But once upon a time, we solely looked at this bell curve. We solely looked at standard scores and percentile ranks for LD. And we would administer, school teams would administer an IQ test, which has generally 4-ish subtests that they're looking at: verbal IQ, nonverbal IQ, working memory, processing speed. They're scoring this on this bell curve and looking at how discrepant these areas are. So if a child has a verbal ability in the 90s and a nonverbal ability at 75, they would say, okay, that's a 15-point discrepancy. And then they'd have to ask, like, is that enough to qualify the kid? And it's been termed the way to fail model, because oftentimes that discrepancy isn't large enough in K1-2 to qualify kids using that old model. And then what happens is early intervention for these kids is delayed, that achievement gap gets bigger, and then by 3rd grade you have an enormous amount of children that are actually qualifying for special ed because they have under SLD, because they haven't had that intervention for K1-2. So for sure, that score discrepancy, that ability discrepancy got much bigger with their academic scores versus their achievement or their cognitive scores. And so yes, you've got a larger number of kids that don't qualify or are not deemed eligible until 3rd grade, which is a bit of a disservice. So again, sharing information from the hospital and any outside reports that you have with the school team, just to kind of present a larger body of evidence, would be, I think, indicated in a situation like this. And then we said about a third of, the research says about a third of children with muscular dystrophy will have attentional weakness or formal diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. The disability checklist under IDEA that a school team would be reviewing to qualify a child under ADHD would be other health impairment, or OHI. This was once upon a time what was called physical disability in Colorado, is now called other health impairment. So the basic premise here is limited strength, limited vitality, and limited alertness. So certainly children with fine and gross motor impairments secondary to muscular dystrophy could qualify under other health impairment that way. Or it could be a comorbid or co-occurring diagnosis of attentional weakness. That could be why we're looking at other health impairments. It's a little bit harder to prove the limited strength, limited vitality, or limited alertness. But if physical fatigue interferes or cognitive fatigue interferes with a child's ability to sustain an entire school day, and has to be on an abbreviated schedule, that's definitely a reason to look at other health impairment. So once you have this meeting and you're going through all these different disability checklists or one disability checklist, you kind of get into more of the meat of this. And this is where I think it gets incredibly overwhelming as a parent. I'm highly trained to do this as my career. My husband is a principal as well. And when we sit at our own children's meetings, I feel incredibly overwhelmed and intimidated. And I stop and think, if I have, 17 years experience in this arena and I feel intimidated, I can't even imagine what it is like for parents who are not, who are not educators by trade. So what are you agreeing to, and how do you know if it's appropriate? It's a great question, right? So you're going to have a lot of really big conversations. The biggest piece of it on the IEP is the least restrictive environment, or LRE. So that is simply the percentage of time spent with non-disabled peers. So non-disabled peers being the least restrictive. So there's a bit of a continuum with least restrictive environments. You have purely the general education setting, and then the sped classroom, then a special school, then a homebound where you have a teacher come to you, and then all the way to a hospital facility or residential facility. Typically, least restrictive environment, in my experience, looks a combo of gen ed and special ed classroom. And this is, I think, where people get a little bit tricky or get a little bit confused. So we'll go into that in a minute. But just so you are all aware too, and you may already know, but homebound is something that you absolutely, in a public education setting, have the right to, if you have a child with these chronic medical needs, or maybe you're having a planned admission in a hospital that you know is going to have your child out of school for greater than 10 to 14 days, typically the average, you are able to discuss with your special education team, even general ed if you have a 504, but you are able to discuss with your child's team the possibility of having an educator from the district travel to you or to the hospital during this treatment phase that you're going through. So it could be post-surgery, it could be for, like I just said, an unplanned admission, but homebound is a wonderful service. It's not a full day's worth of teaching. It's typically just focused on core subjects, reading, writing, and math, for a few hours a week. But it is definitely, I think, a wonderful service. I think it's really hard for parents to don several different hats of being a nurse and being a friend and being a parent, and so unloading any of that, I think those responsibilities, and being a teacher additionally, I think is good for family dynamic. Sadly, with all the budget cuts in education, homebound is typically one of the first to get a little bit of a budget slash. So when I first started at Children's 10 years ago, the biggest district in the urban area, Denver Public Schools, would offer 5 hours a week for elementary school kids of homebound instruction, or 10 hours a week for secondary, middle and high school. So 10 years ago, that was what they did. Now it's 2 hours a week so it went from 5 to 2 for elementary age kids, and it went from 10 to 5 for secondary kids. So it tends to be the place where the budgets get cut first. So when we talk about least restrictive environment, or when you guys are in the meetings talking about it, people are going to add some other words in there. They're going to start saying mainstream. They're going to start saying inclusion. They're going to start saying self-contained classroom. They're going to start saying gen ed. You might even hear gen pop, which is the general population. I don't love when people say that. It makes it sound like a prison to me, but people do throw it out there. But the biggest ones that I hear are mainstream and inclusion. And I think that they get misinterpreted sometimes. So an example of a least restrictive environment that your team might consider is in the general education setting 80% of the time. So that's the majority of time with non-disabled peers. And there's typically some pull-out support that's individualized with a special ed teacher or an OT or a PT, in addition to some push-in. And this is what folks typically mean when they say mainstream. I want my child mainstream. If you're saying I want my child mainstreamed, you are typically saying something like this. I like it. I like the concept better with the push-in, especially for older kids, middle school and high school. I think if weak fine motor skills, for example, is an OT goal, I think it makes the most sense for the occupational therapist to work in the classroom, because this is where we're saying there's educational impact, right? With classroom tasks or bimanually resistive tasks, or things like that. So I don't know, to me, that it makes much sense to remove the kids from the educational setting where this is most impactful. But I think, mainstream in this sense of the word mainstream, I think works well. I think it gives time in general ed, and I think it gives individualized time outside of gen ed, where you're having hopefully some more intensive intervention and support. 100% of the time, it's another way you might read it, 100% of the time in gen ed setting, meaning every support, service, etc., comes to the child. So this could look like a co-taught class. When I did teach in public schools, this is what we did the last couple years I was teaching. There was one gentleman who taught 4th, 5th, and 6th grade literacy. He taught reading for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And then another woman who taught 4th, 5th, and 6th writing, and then a gentleman who taught 4th, 5th, and 6th math. And so we co-taught everything. So I just stayed in the room and taught with the general education teacher. So we had our planning times together. I knew what his lessons were going to be. I was able to help adapt materials to meet the needs of the kids on my caseload that were in class. It's hard to do, but it can be done. I do like it too for social skills, with some behavioral concerns of children. I think that social skills interventions and behavioral interventions are lovely. But I think if we take a group of children who have decreased social skills and we take them out and put them in a separate setting, I don't know that that's a great place to work on social skills, because we've got a bunch of kids identified as having trouble with that, and then we removed them from the environment that gives them the most trouble. It's not really generalizable. It's not going to go back with them into the classroom. So I like inclusion as defined this way, because I think you get to work on the deficit where the deficit appears most in real time. So these terms get used a lot. Sometimes they get used inappropriately. These are my preferred definitions of them. This is the way I understand them from my training. And when you're talking about mainstream and inclusion and least restrictive environment, we oftentimes bring in other terms like equal versus equitable. So equal and equitable in the least restrictive environment is a tricky subject. It gets difficult sometimes. And we have to go back to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, where all of this falls under, because the biggest principle is that children are guaranteed a free and appropriate public education. FAPE, another one of the awesome acronyms we have in special ed. So under free and appropriate public education, the key word is appropriate. I think it would be amazing if there was inclusion settings where things were co-taught and there were therapists in classrooms and all of these things, and everybody had a one-on-one aid and had access to everything. But it's not typically what is funding allows for these situations. And so it's my professional opinion that sometimes it's not appropriate for a child with significant needs to spend a lot of time or most of their time with non-disabled peers, because sometimes the needs are just so great that they really just can't be provided well in that setting. And it's tragic, I think, sometimes to see children with complex, learning and cognitive needs sitting in the back of a room and just sitting, right? And so you're sacrificing, sometimes quality instruction and more appropriate instruction with the need to have them, in an inclusive setting. If it's not a well-orchestrated inclusive setting, I think it is actually detrimental. And so it can be hard. We've all seen this graphic before, the inclusive setting that's not orchestrated well might look like the equality side of this, right? Where every kid's getting equal treatment. They're all in the same space, but it's not equitable, right? It can be super inequitable. And I think what happens, again, which is well intended, I think what happens when kids with significant needs are in the general education setting, they're often with a paraprofessional. And I started my career 18 years ago as a paraprofessional. I have much respect for paraprofessionals, but they are oftentimes the least qualified person to be working with these students. And so, that just is what it is, right? They're often the least qualified person. So if your child is spending a huge chunk of time in the general education setting, they're being supported potentially by the least qualified person. And so it takes them away from the special education teacher being the most qualified person. And we all know how big special ed teachers' caseloads are. We all know how cumbersome certain aspects of special education can be if you're managing a caseload of 30 kids with 30 IEPs to do every year. I get it, it's all well intended, but there tends to be a high turnover for paraprofessionals. There's a lot of underqualified paraprofessionals. So it's just something I think to think about when we're asking for certain allowances or certain settings in under least restricted environments. So I'm assuming there'll be some questions about that we'll do at the end. So I'm gonna jump over into, we went to what am I agreeing to? So that's your LRE and your minutes of service and your setting. And how do I know if it's appropriate? Accommodation, intervention, and strategy. We're gonna talk a little bit about this. And this, to me, is where you get into the how do I know if it's appropriate part of the IEP. So we are really good in special education with using the words accommodation and intervention. I think we have a long way to go as educators to incorporate strategy, okay? So I do this presentation or parts of this presentation for school districts. And I always intend to stay on this slide or these next two slides for just like a little bit of time, and we end up staying on them almost the whole time because it's tricky. So in the IEP and during the IEP process, you are going to talk about academic educational accommodations that your child is granted. So, and these are used incorrectly all the time, especially accommodation modification. But anyway, so an accommodation is a change to the environment that gives a child access to learning. You also have accommodations in 504 plans, so they are on both. So a good example of that is if you have a decreased ability to read, or your reading fluency is poor, or you're dyslexic, or you have a visual impairment, whatever, your IEP can say that you have access to audiobooks. And I always get made fun of because I call them books on tape. Says that I'm old, but and you have access to an audiobook as your accommodation. So it doesn't improve your child's decoding skills or ability to read words, but it does give access to the content so that the child who has this accommodation can participate in the discussion, right? So that's an accommodation. Another accommodation that people love to say is preferential seating for attentional weakness. So you can sit in the front of the class if that makes the most sense. Or if you're a child that needs to move, your accommodation could be the back of the class with permission to stand as needed. Extended time. I don't like that one. We can have a whole other presentation about why I don't love extended time. So those are different types of accommodation. When you get into an intervention, it's an instructional intervention is a specific program or set of steps to help its child improve in an area of need. So it's usually aimed at a weakness, a particular area of weakness, very intentionally aimed at it. It's very specific. There's usually built-in progress monitoring, and it usually lasts for months or weeks. It is reviewed at certain intervals. Interventions for, let's see, for reading could be Orton-Gillingham is one of the best research-based. So Orton-Gillingham or the Wilson Reading System or Linden-Wood-Bell, those are great instructional interventions for reading. Social skills intervention could be the zones of regulation curriculum or Superflex curriculum. So they are aimed at remediating a weakness, and you are more easily keeping track of them over time. A strategy, which is what I love, a strategy is a set of methods or activities to teach a child something. So for me, strategy is synonymous with support. So instructional interventions may include a strategy, but not all strategies are interventions. And this is where the teachers in the room go, what? So for example, if you are using the Orton-Gillingham intervention to remediate reading, one of the strategies for reading 2-syllable words is to make a line in between the syllables and take your pen and scoop the first one and scoop the second one. So the intervention is Orton-Gillingham. The strategy is breaking apart a 2-syllable word into separate syllables and reading each syllable at a time before you blend it together. So there's the intervention and there's the strategy, right? So you need all of them. And if you're leaving out the strategy, to me, you're doing a disservice. So to continue it a bit, on the left is the traditional approach, right? The therapist, the teacher, the parent, whatever, selects goals for the student that is based solely on the impairment. The student practices skill building, such as flashcards, worksheets. I don't know, and the worksheets could even be part of an intervention, right? So not just like, busy work worksheets, but some interventions for reading include the kinesthetic approach and the we do it together approach, but they also often have independent practice times via worksheets. So traditional approach would be to build a program based on a student impairment and practice on that impairment, okay? The contextually relevant approach is a collaborative goal-setting mindset that includes the student, the family, and the team members. And the student and the family and the team members all learn to apply compensatory strategies to accomplish everyday tasks. So I like to break it down a bit more to say, if a child has a fine motor weakness that impairs their ability to write, they probably also have a fine motor weakness that impairs their ability to don and doff their clothes. You probably have occupational therapy goals that are fine motor, pincer, bimanually resistive task oriented. So the premise behind this is that the weakness in fine motor skills is not just impactful during writing, it's impactful, period, right? And so if we just remediate the writing piece, or if we just focus on a built up pencil for writing, why don't we also build up the toothbrush? Or why don't we also build up the fork and the spoon, right? So we need to do these things across multiple settings. We need to come up with a strategy or a way to compensate across multiple settings so that we're not just drilling and killing and working on the one thing. Another example would be attention, right? Poor attention is poor attention. It is, not just in biology. So if you identify as a teacher that a child struggles to attend and therefore has difficulty sequencing the steps for a multi-step math problem, I bet you if you ask the parent, that child also has trouble attending and sequencing the steps for their chores, right? So if we just provide support in the math class that's solely related to the math problem, we missed the mark because we didn't support the whole thing. We're not compensating across deficits. So if you want to use, right, attention, verbal information, attention is fleeting. So verbal information, not awesome for anyone who has attentional weakness. Write it down. So the compensatory strategy you might discuss is giving the child a checklist to move through to solve the complex math problem. Then you generalize it. Give the child a checklist on the dishwasher that tells them how to move through the sequenced steps of emptying the dishwasher. So it might say cups and mugs, plates and bowls, silverware. And at school, it might say, start with the ones, ask myself, can I take 7 from 9? If the answer is C, see my point? Like if you're having trouble sequencing, it's not just happening in one place. So intervening in one place is not going to help generalize across settings. A compensatory strategy is. So I think you can't have a good IEP meeting unless you're talking about all three. It is a super thorn in my side, the extended time accommodation. It is a super thorn in my side to say wait time if someone has a slow processing speed. There are 30 kids in a classroom. A teacher can't wait 10 seconds after she delivers every piece of verbal information. I mean, see, you can't do it. So you can't just accommodate, you have to compensate. And you have to provide really great strategies to help kids increase their independence. So a couple more examples. So an intervention for dyslexia and dysgraphia would be that explicit instruction and a research-based phonics intervention. An intervention for social skills, like I said, is superflex for zones of regulation. But then for another kid with a fine motor deficit in the purple, you could do both, or in a poor attention deficit, you could do both. The accommodation for students with poor attention or poor memory, who just work slowly than other kids, is if the teacher's saying, today, hands out an assignment that's a 5 to 7 paragraph, essay, an opinion piece on, PlayStation versus Nintendo Switch. I don't know. But if the lesson is that, The accommodation for the student with poor attention or slower speed or weak memory would be that they're going to deliver that assignment incrementally. So that might be the whole class just gets that big assignment, and your child gets the introduction assigned on Monday, and the introduction is due Wednesday. So the child just works on that one day. And then the 3 body paragraphs are given for homework on Thursday. Those are due the following Monday. The teacher. So incrementally delivering assignments is a great accommodation for kids that get really overwhelmed, who have poor attention, who work slower than other kids. But then the strategy would also be then to provide the checklist of the steps the kid needs to do to complete it. So that's the, maybe the triangle that literacy teachers use. They use a triangle to show the introduction, meaning you're going from general to specific. So you're giving a visual to help the child do the introduction independently, while you're saying you just do the introduction for now and you deliver it incrementally. So you can do both, and you need to do both, in my opinion. The other part about, what am I agreeing to and how do I know if it's appropriate? One of my things that I do is I audit IEPs for appropriate goals. And there are very high levels of inappropriate goals out there. So SMART goals need to be in IEPs. SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, and usually have action words, relevant, and time-bound. So we go wrong here a lot as teachers. So a somewhat specific goal would be Gregory will improve reading skills to second grade level. It's somewhat specific. It's not specific enough because it doesn't say what his reading level currently is. If his reading level is currently kinder, we don't expect anyone to improve their reading skills by 2 years. Not non-disabled kids don't have to do that. So it would be not a great goal, because my first question would be, well, what's his reading level now? And how are you going to get there? What intervention are you going to do to get there? And how are you going to measure it? So it's not specific at all, in my opinion. So Gregory will improve his reading skills from a first grade level to a second grade level by participating in an Orton Gillingham intervention 4 times a week. Like, very specific, right? You need to get more info in there. The measurable piece, I love this for self-advocacy goals, right? Or social emotional goals. Alan will demonstrate understanding of others' feelings. How are you doing that? What does that even mean? Does that mean you're playing with him and his friends on the playground? You're the teacher and you're out there, and the kid's like, I want to swing first, and Alan's like, no, I'm going to swing for the whole period. I mean, that's not a thing that you could do. So you have to ask questions like, is that attainable? I don't know. And how is he demonstrating it? There's not a lot of action words in there. So it might be like, Alan will demonstrate understanding of internal self states by circling an emoji provided by the zones of regulation curriculum across these things. So you have to get a bit more specific in there, because this is your child's yearly plan. It needs to make sense, and it needs to be individualized and specific in order for it to mean really anything. So this piece is a little bit trickier. Here's some more examples. So when presented with a checklist of steps to complete a literacy task, student will initiate the task with 2 reminders. A large group instruction with teachers and peers, student will replace inappropriate interruptions with a written sticky note. So that's something I do a lot. Like I said, I teach kids with brain injuries, so they are super disinhibited, right? They don't pause very often. So they want to say everything, and they just want to flying out of their mouth. So we give them sticky notes. I give a little pad of sticky notes and a pen. I usually put a bullseye on their table too, because I teach them that the bullseye means to stay on target. So when they just have the kiddo that just is like verbal, output, we teach them, hey, here's the sticky note. I love that you have so many things to say, but that whole class I have to teach. If you could draw a picture or jot down a couple notes of what you want to say on these sticky notes, I will come back and talk to you after the lesson, and then you can tell me all of the awesome things you want to share. So that's a way to explicitly teach weight, explicitly teach inhibition. And then, independently move through the steps to clean up the lunch area and wash the hands by referencing the visual cue. provided. So this is another one that's easily generalizable. If a child is not cleaning up their workspace, not washing their hands independently in a school setting, they're also probably not doing that at home. So that's a good example of how you can partner with the school to get activities of daily living supported in both settings too. Like I said, these things are super, these meetings can be really intimidating, and you have the right as a parent to not sign anything at the meeting. You can say, I am not ready to sign that I agree to this plan or whatever. You can take it home and sit on it and sign it, when you're ready. You also have the right to preview the draft of the IEP prior to your meeting. So I encourage parents to do both of those things. You also, I think it's a powerful exercise to have something like this in your IEP binder, which I would highly recommend making a binder that has your child's ed records in it. I love this questionnaire. It's simple, it's on understood.org. It lets you do a little pre-IEP meeting work of things that you want to ask. It gives you a couple examples of things that you might want to say during the meeting, and can help you feel a bit more prepared. You also have a lot of resources out there. Some are location specific, others are not. You've probably heard of some of these. Like I just said, understood.org is a great one. Rightslaw.com is a great one. If they do several, Pete and his wife do a lot of conferences across the country, the rights they do. But also you have this group called the Hospital Educator and Academic Liaison Association, or HEAL, healassociation.org. I am on the executive board for HEAL. We are a group, nationwide nonprofit of hospital-based educators and academic liaisons that are embedded in children's hospitals. So you may already know of these folks if you are, like St. Jude's got some folks out there, and Vanderbilt, obviously Children's Colorado, we have like 17 teachers that work there. Cincinnati has a huge school services presence. Lurie, Riley, they're everywhere. So check out the healassociation.org. And when you're in clinic, you can ask, maybe an educator is not embedded in your clinic like I am at Children's, but they're on staff. So if you need help in reviewing an IEP, or if you want to ask questions specifically related to these plans, reach out to the hospital-based educators. I think right now our membership is 165. So there's quite a few of us all over the country that are experts in kids with chronic medical needs and who specialize in acting as a liaison between hospitals, parents, and school teams. There are, also advocates out there too, but sometimes, advocates are 100% necessary for sure, but sometimes that liaison piece can help preserve your relationship with your school team while also preserving your sanity. So that's all for me. I think we do Q&A now, Nicole, is that right?
Thanks, Jodi. Yeah, and we had someone chat in that this was very incredibly informative, and she definitely appreciates it. So yes, I agree. I do think that it was a lot of information. I think just having those resources mentioned is a good step for folks to reach out to, because not everyone is in a major city or near a children's hospital that has access to one of the HEAL folks that you had mentioned of. So I think just knowing where to reach out is really, really helpful. I wanted to ask, with COVID and the virtual learning space now, how has that implicated or impacted IEPs with families? I have a feeling it has to have had some sort of impact on that.
Yeah, huge. And it's just different everywhere. I wish I had like this overarching, like, you're supposed to be doing this. Schools are writing contingency plans for IEPs. So, and that looks different everywhere. But the spring, I'm sure everywhere was a mess. Like teachers and educators essentially were reinventing what public education looked like in a matter of weeks. Sometimes a weekend. So unfortunately, I do not think that many services were delivered with fidelity as written on an IEP. I do know that if you are still remote in your area, that there is a way more detailed plan about how IEP minutes are being met. Therapy minutes should be upheld virtually if you're not going to school. Accommodations and strategies and interventions. If you're doing a remote session, I know some people are paper and pencil. Some of the more, like in Colorado, some of the rural areas, they're not doing like Google Classroom or Seesaw. They're doing paper and pencil. But if your district is providing, synchronous instruction over a computer, they should be also delivering the IEP minutes. There should be a small group pullout if kids are getting interventions. There should be, they need to be doing it. It is a legally binding document. My question for them would be, what is the district's, ask your district, what is your contingency plan? What is my IEP contingency plan? And what do my minutes look like while we are no longer in person?
And we had someone chat in that says, great information. We have our IEP via Zoom this coming week. It's going to look very different since we have chosen remote learning until a vaccine is found. And I think that's very, very common amongst our MDA families is, we don't want to send the children that have immune compromised systems to school until there is a vaccine. That's why we're doing these engage events, remote. We don't want to put our families and at a just a chance to get sick. So we feel
so I think those would be the questions if you're heading in, for that family who posted that question, if you're heading into your IEP meeting, questions that you want to ask are, during remote learning, what percentage of instruction is synchronous versus asynchronous, right? So live versus worksheets or independent time. And based on that answer, you want to ask them, during asynchronous learning, how are you implementing my child's accommodations and interventions? Because that's their independent time, right? So if your accommodation says that your child will do 50% reduced number of items, again, I'm making this up, but then you want to ask them, like, so when it's independent time and they're supposed to be doing math, are you loading a different math sheet for me that is reduced by 50%? You want that, those are the questions, synchronous versus asynchronous. It's easy to deliver interventions synchronous, obviously. You have a breakout with your Google Classroom or your Seesaw or your Zoom, whatever you're doing. But it's that asynchronous time that gets a little bit tricky because that's the independent time we know is challenging for kids with complex needs. So you want to ask that question. And then you also want to ask, and based on your comfortability, but some districts who are remote, I don't have a choice. We're just remote in Denver until at least the 16th of October, which is terrifying. But some districts who are doing that, who don't give the option, are providing an option for students on IEPs to come to school individually or in small groups for direct instruction from the teacher. So the rest of the kids will be at home, but 2 days a week, your child might have the option to come in for OT. With the plexiglass and with the lots of schools and districts have invested in that to bring high needs kids back. Okay.
And the SMART goals, is that something, obviously the parent and the educator has to agree on those. As far as wiggle room, I guess as far as the SMART goals, are those more determined by the school or are those more influenced by the parent?
It's like probably 70-30.
Okay.
There's going to be a lot of like academic ones in there that are going to be determined by the school. But again, when you're talking about the executive functioning ones, like the attention ones, attentional weakness or those kinds of things, I think the parents should have a lot of input there, because I know when I was going through my master's, I got zero in instruction on executive functioning and how to support attention and memory and those kinds of things. And I think you get a lot about LD, and it's very, very different. So parents should have a lot of say, I think, if there's goals related to self-advocacy, if there's goals related to, those strategies of independence, because that's like what I was saying, if everyone has the goal to increase this child's independence, then the parent should have a huge say in what that looks like, because they ideally should transfer that to home and to school.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
And I just want to bring to everyone's attention that obviously your name and your email is on the screen as well as your
Mhm.
number. So if people want to reach out to Jodi for further information or for questions that they have, please feel free to do that. And thank you, Jodi, very much for your time today.
Yes, of
I think
course.
that with school getting in session and starting, this was a great session to have at this particular time of the year. So thank you very
Oh,
much.
good. And everybody check out that Heal, website. I think if you're a member, you can see the member directory. So I'm not suggesting that you spend the $60 to be a member, but if you are curious to know, I mean, it would be great if you did, but it would be curious to know if you want to know if there are educators in your hospitals that you go to, email me. I can look at the member directory and I can try to connect you with the appropriate people in your area.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you
Mhm.
very much.
Yep.
Definitely appreciate it. And I just want to let everyone know that up next at the top of the hour, we will hear from Brittany Green and Grace Schmidt on physical therapy and nutrition. So get your questions ready. We will be back shortly. Thank you.